Thank you, Larry. You are really in for a great treat. It was my pleasure when I was in Pittsburgh, working with the World Affairs Council there, hosted Ambassador Don Gregg on at least 2 occasions, Don, and each one of them were hugely successful, riveting programs. But then the life of Don Gregg has been constantly in connection with riveting issues. If you had a chance to take a look at, I commend the full bio to you, which is on the World Affairs Council's website. I'm not going to read all of that to you, but I want to hit just a couple of highlights. I mean, this is a man whom many of us more recently think of in association with Korea. For many years he was the president of the Korea Society. He's now chairman emeritus of the Korea Society, having retired from that position. And before that he was U.S. ambassador to Korea. But he was also in Asia for many years with the Central Intelligence Agency. He was in the Army. He was on the National Security Council staff dealing with Asian issues and Korean issues and on nuclear issues. He was National Security Advisor to then Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush, and then went on to be ambassador to Korea under President Bush at a particularly critical time when, as he might mention himself, in which the United States withdrew nuclear weapons from Korea. And of course it was Mr. Gregg, working with the CIA, that had been involved in dealing with South Korea at a time when South Korea was developing its own nuclear weapons program clandestinely. This is a man who has been in many parts of government and dealing with many issues of government throughout his 4+ decades of government service. But one of those men who has been quiet, behind the scenes source of wisdom and counsel, but not the man in the headlines from which we often know. And that's what makes it especially appealing to me to introduce you to him to you and you to him, because he is a man of considerable integrity for which service to the government in broader causes is very much in his DNA. Of course, there's some Colorado Springs in his DNA too, by the way. He was just telling us that his father graduated from Colorado College, and Pastor Gregg himself has an honorary degree from Colorado College, and his father met his future bride after World War I when she was Dean of Women at Colorado College, and from time to time throughout his growing up years spent a considerable amount of time here, and we are delighted that Ambassador Gregg continues to have strong connections to this town and will be coming back and forth in the future as well. But it is a great pleasure and a great honor to introduce Ambassador Donald Gregg to you, a man who has won numerous awards, too many to mention, but he honors us with his presence today. Ambassador Gregg.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction. I am just absolutely delighted to be here. And I woke up thinking this morning, 100 years ago, my father was just completing his sophomore year at Colorado College. That sort of places me in the timeline. I also want to congratulate this group for all of the things that it is doing. This is the third time I've spoken to you. Once was at the Antlers and the other was at the Broadmoor. And this is a far larger group than I've ever spoken to here. And you are doing beautifully what far too few groups like this do, and that is establish connections with local educational institutions at the college and high school level. The real point of organizations like this is to keep people interested and aware of foreign policy issues that we're dealing with. And the future belongs to them, not to us. And too often, I go to a place and there is nobody there who's within 40 years of having graduated from high school. The worst of all was in San Diego, where they were either had too much to drink or were too deaf to hear me. So anyway, I'm delighted that people from the high school and the Air Force Academy are here, and I think the program you have to reach out to these programs is terrific. And I'm on the board of advisors to the Council on Foreign Relations group, and I'm going to urge them to get in touch with you to find out how to do a better job. Well, my title is a sort of quirky one. What do Ho Chi Minh, Saddam Hussein, and Kim Jong-il have in common? And I'm going to make it even quirkier by adding a fourth name, Muammar Gaddafi. And why am I talking about these people? It's because all of them have given us, or are giving us, tremendous problems. We have used a mixture of measures in dealing with them, probably I would say less successfully than successfully. And there's no end in sight of the processions of bizarre characters with whom we will have to contend as the future unrolls. So what I will try to do today is point out some factors that I think might be learning lessons for us in looking back on how we have dealt with these four men. First is Ho Chi Minh. And the opening scene in my talk is the jungles of North Vietnam in 1945. And an OSS team is parachuted in to work with the Viet Minh, who are very effective fighters against the Japanese, who had occupied parts of North Vietnam. And the medic on that team was a man named Paul Hoagland, who later worked for CIA, where I knew him. And as soon as he hit the ground, he was taken by the reception committee to a grass shack, and they said, "Our leader is dying, please save him." And in he went, and here was a skeletal, wispy, whiskered man suffering dreadfully from malaria and dysentery, and it was Ho Chi Minh. And his life was saved. And he was tremendously grateful to the United States. And the Constitution of North Korea was based upon our Declaration of Independence. And he wanted good relations with us. But we had seen the French defeat in Dien Bien Phu in 1954, not as the end of colonialism in Southeast Asia, but as something in the Cold War. And so we listened to the siren song of the French and tried to help them reestablish some kind of regime in South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh wrote a series of letters to the Department of State urging us not to do that. I don't know this for a fact, but I am told a number of them have been declassified, but some have not and probably never will be because the contents are so tragic. So we went to war in Vietnam. I spent 4 years in that war. And we totally misread 1,000 years of Chinese-Vietnamese history. That was a history of enmity. But we went to war with a shoulder patch which symbolized the Great Wall of China with a gap in it, and the American sword thrusting into the gap, repelling Chinese aggression into South Vietnam. And we heard all about the domino theory, saying if Vietnam falls, the next is going to be Thailand or Laos and Burma and all of the countries in Southeast Asia. And so that galvanized our participation in a truly tragic war. I was one of the first people trained in counterinsurgency in 1963. It was a word in vogue. We had to learn how to win the hearts and minds of people. And we all got to go to the White House and shake JFK's hand, which was a thrilling moment for me. He was an electrifying person in person. And we all were empowered to do the best we could in fighting what was essentially almost an impossible war to win, because the North Vietnamese were absolutely determined to reunify their country. Demographically, they were able to sustain the rate of casualties that we were inflicting upon them. Unlike Korea, where South Korea was sealed off from the north and protected by the sea, South Vietnam was flanked by the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so we never were able to stop the flow of men and material into the south. We had 3 generals there, all of whom I knew. Paul Harkins was the first commander, and he greeted me in 1962 when I stopped through on my way back to Washington to run CIA operations into the Vietnam War. And he said, "I don't care what you hear from anybody else, we're going to be out of here with a military victory in 6 months." That was February 1962. I went with Robert McNamara to Seoul in December 1963. We were all draped in black. JFK was dead. CM was dead. And McNamara was looking over what was going on, and he heard the same mantra: "We'll be out of here with a military victory in 6 months." He was furious. And he said, "I will not take it. I demand another hearing from you guys tomorrow, and I want a better analysis." And so the analysis was, well, it might take us 12 months rather than 6 months. And so General Harkins was replaced by General Westmoreland. And when he went into South Vietnam, we had under 20,000 troops. When he left 4 years later, we had 523,000, and the fighting went on. We were ably assisted by Korea. I understand there's a Korean officer here, Colonel Yan. I welcome him here, and I want to thank him particularly for the fact that South Korea sent 312,000 troops to help us in Vietnam, as 2 divisions in full strength for almost 10 years. They were terrific, and they did a more thorough job of pacifying the 2 provinces they were responsible for than we did in many cases. The third general was General Abrams, and he was by far the best of the 3. And at the end of my tour, I had been useful to the military in a variety of ways, and so a farewell lunch was given for me. And I said, "Well, General, you've been here a long time." He said, "Yeah, I've been here 6 years." And I said, "Well, how do you keep going so long?" He said, "Well, I keep learning." And I said, "Well, would you mind telling me what your latest lesson is?" I didn't dump on him. I put that as politely as I could. And he said, "Well, I just read a wonderful book by the French author Bernard Fall about the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. It's called Hell in a Very Small Place." And he said, "There's a phrase in that I understand now that I wouldn't have understood before." And I said, "What's the phrase?" He said, "Well, the French lost because they failed to politically organize the terrain." Well, my thought was, if it took you, sir, 6 years to understand it, no wonder we're losing. So I left. I'm going to jump forward a little bit because I met General Petraeus, and I want to strike a high note after this rather dismal recitation. This was a dinner in his honor in New York a couple of years ago. And it's in his honor, and I stood in line to shake his hand, and I heard him handle a couple of people ahead of me brilliantly. And so I went up to him and I said, "General, I was looking for you in Vietnam, but I couldn't find you." He said, "Gee, I was just in high school." I said, "Well, I know that, but I was looking for somebody who really understood what we were doing. And I want to thank you for promoting some of the officers who were there into general officer ranks and using them as you have rejiggered our counterinsurgency approach." That same term that I was introduced in 1963, we're still learning about it in 2011. And I think that Petraeus brings us closer to a true understanding of what is necessary than any military officer we've ever had. I think we are extremely fortunate to have him. And I think if we are not able to sustain ourselves in Afghanistan, he will have given it the best possible shot. So we are truly fortunate to have him, and there are others like him coming along. So we demonized Ho Chi Minh. We didn't listen to his gratitude. We didn't listen to his pleas. And so we fought a war which we never should have fought. Next figure is Saddam Hussein. I won't spend as long on him. Now, he was a man who, to use the phrase demonizing, who deserved demonizing in many ways. Perfectly horrible, sadistic dictator. And so the decision was to go into Iraq and finish the job that George W. Bush felt that his father should have completed after Desert Storm. And the issue, the central issue to this was he's working on nuclear weapons, and he's going to get them, and we've got to stop him before he completes them. And he is in bed with Al-Qaeda, and we need to put that to a stop. Could I have a glass of water? And so, thank you. As bad as he was, we assumed incorrectly that he was working on nuclear weapons and that he was in bed with Al-Qaeda. And the intelligence profession in both the UK and the United States was under terrific pressure to come up with intelligence that would justify this. And I was invited to a fascinating conference at a center in the UK called Ditchley, where a number of former intelligence officers, including the retired head of MI6, the acting or the deputy director of CIA, the former head of the DDI and CIA were there, and the discussion was, how did we miss the call? How did both of our countries miss the call on these two issues? And the answer was essentially the same. There was terrific pressure from Tony Blair on MI6 to come up with evidence that that Saddam Hussein was guilty of these two gross acts. And there was immense pressure on CIA from the White House, and particularly Vice President Cheney, to do the same thing. And one of the people at that conference was a woman named Jamie Mishik, who was the highest ranking woman in the history of CIA. She was Deputy Director for Intelligence. She was the chief analyst at CIA, and she was there. And she got up and said, the tough issue we're talking about here is speaking truth to power. Speaking truth to power. And you guys and gals in the military, pay attention to this, because this is really where the rubber meets the road and where a character gets built or gets pushed away. Because if you're in the intelligence business or in the analytical business, the most important thing you can do is tell your leader what he doesn't want to hear, but what he needs to hear. And Ms. Mishik gave an example of this. Muammar Gaddafi had given up his nuclear weapons. I'll get into that later. And there was a long report on why he had done it. And there was one section which speculated that he might have done it because he didn't want us to do to him what we were doing in Iraq. And then it was dismissed. But she was asked to declassify that section in itself by the vice president. And she would not do it. And so he went back to the White House, and Porter Goss, who was the director of CIA, was called on the phone. And he said, I want that part of that report declassified because it will be contributing evidence to the rightness of what we were doing in Iraq. And so J.B. Mishik was called in and said, the vice president wants you to declassify that article, part of that report. And she said, I will not do it, and he fired her on the spot. And she was there a week after he had fired her, and she said the issue is how tough it is to tell truth to power when they don't want to hear it. And so we went into Iraq, and he hadn't been in bed with al-Qaeda, and he hadn't been working on nuclear weapons at that time. He'd had a program earlier on which he had stopped. And so one of the Brits put it perfectly. He said, we couldn't prove that he was doing either thing, but we knew he was. And so when we went in, we knew we'd find the evidence that he was doing it. Well, there was no evidence. And why did we know he was doing it? Because we demonized him. Because he was a bad guy. He was a bad guy, but he wasn't that bad. And we let our prejudice blind us to the facts and to the lack of intelligence. And so there's Saddam Hussein. Now, Kim Jong-il is very, very easy to demonize. He's funny looking. He is a voluptuary. He's probably drunk more than I have spilled, or spilled more than I have drunk, I guess is the way to put it. Yeah, spilled more than I have drunk. He runs things in a very draconian fashion. And so we have picked up a phrase that we don't talk to people because that would be rewarding bad behavior. Now, how would that work in a schoolroom? Wouldn't work very well, would it? Well, it doesn't work very well on the international stage either. I've been to North Korea 5 times. They have built nuclear weapons because they see it as the greatest possible deterrent to our attacking them again. And they're not going to give up their nuclear weapons unless they are sure through talks with us that we have no intention of going after them. And they are far from that assurance as it is now. In 1962, I made my first trip to North Korea. Was received in a very friendly way. And Kim Dae-gwan, who was their leading nuclear negotiator, asked me 3 questions. First, this is April 2002, almost 9 years ago. Why is George W. Bush so different from his father? Well, I said, we're a big country, and Father Bush was raised in New England, Junior Bush was raised in Texas, and that puts a different stamp on people.
Second question, how is it that you can function as a country when you elect people who have nothing in common with their predecessors? And I said, well, you have what we might call continuity of leadership, so you don't have to deal with that problem. But democracy works that way. If the people don't like what a president has been doing, they vote him out of office and put somebody else in. And the root of his question was that at the end of the Clinton administration, relations had improved very rapidly because a missile issue had been solved by Bill Perry, an excellent Secretary of Defense. The second highest ranking man in North Korea had been visited Washington, was invited to the White House, and went to see Bill Clinton in uniform, and invited Bill Clinton to visit Pyongyang. And Al Gore gave a luncheon for him at the top floor of the State Department, and a lot of friendly things were said, and Madeleine Albright announced that she was going to North Korea to check out the possibility of Bill Clinton's visiting. And she went. And she had 11 hours of discussion with Kim Jong-il. And I've talked to her about that, and she's very funny about talking about it, because she said he was extremely intelligent. I was surprised by it. And I was with her at the University of Michigan one time, and she spoke first, and she said, well, Kim Jong-il and I have quite a lot in common. We're both about the same height, we both wear high heels, and we both put mousse in our hair. And, but she then went on to say how intelligent he was. And Clinton wanted to go, but time ran out, and he no longer was president, and so he didn't go. And in came George W. Bush, and his Secretary of State, Colin Powell, said, we're going to take up with North Korea right where the Clinton people left off. But that was not true. As Colin Powell has said to me, I got a little too far forward on my skis, and that didn't work out. What did work out was that George W. Bush called North Korea part of the axis of evil in his State of the Union speech of 2002. And so when the North Koreans asked me how we could function when we elect such different presidents, that's what he had in mind. Because in December 2000, they almost had a president sitting as their guest, and 14 months later they were part of the axis of evil, having done nothing in between to justify that. To show you they have a sense of humor, his third question was, well, why don't you understand us better? And I said, well, you're very tough to deal with as an intelligence target. I said, you know, I was chasing you around for years, and they knew that. They used to drop leaflets denouncing me when I was ambassador. And I said, you were very difficult to recruit. We could recruit Soviets, we could recruit Chinese. I could see them sort of swelling with pride as I told them that. I said, but you were very difficult to recruit, and so we can look down on you with satellites, and we can listen to you through SIGINT, but we cannot get inside your heads. And then he really surprised me, and he said, are you wearing your op center hat when you give me that analysis? And I said, what? He said, you heard me. Are you wearing your op center hat? And Op Center is a book written by Tom Clancy. The central character of it is a man named Gregory Donald. My name is Donald Gregg. And Gregory Donald was chief of station in South Korea, which I was, and was later ambassador to South Korea, which I was. And so there's a certain connection. And how it happened was that I don't know Clancy, but he had a co-author who had known me in CIA and decided to do this without asking me. I got a lot of chaff on it. Well, I said, I haven't read the book, but my wife has, and would you like her impression? And they said, yes. And I said, well, she refers to it as an airport-only paperback. And I said, she doesn't really mind the fact that I died an honorable death at the end of the book, but she's furious about the fact that I'd had a Korean mistress. And they all laughed at that. And the North Koreans are not that different from the South Koreans. They fear us, and their immediate take on what's going on in Libya is to say Gaddafi was stupid to give up his nuclear weapons, as you never would have done what you're doing if he still had them. And I think there's a good deal to that, and I'll refer back to that a little bit. So there is Kim Jong-il. I hand-carried in 2002 a written offer from him to start negotiations with the United States. It was dismissed out of hand by Steve Hadley, who was Condoleezza Rice's deputy at the National Security Council, who said, no, we won't talk to them, that would be rewarding bad behavior. And so I get back to that as, I think, a tack that we ought to get off of. People need to be not talked to. I was a great friend of Dick Holbrooke, the late, lamented Dick Holbrooke. And he and I knew each other very well, and he thought that Slobodan Milosevic was one of the worst people he'd ever seen in his life. He said, I hated talking with the man. He was repulsive, but we had to talk to him to stop the genocide. So I am all for talking. Now a little bit on Gaddafi. At this conference that I mentioned in London, people had heard me talking about the need to keep talking with people you don't like so that you don't have to fight them. And a British friend brought over a very handsome man and said, I'd like to have you meet Sir Adam Wilson. That's not his true name. If I told you his true name, I'd have to kill you. Anyway, he's the third man ever to be knighted by MI6, which is their equivalent of CIA. And I said, well, may I ask what it was that you did to justify this? And the answer from the other one was, well, he talked Gaddafi into giving up his nuclear weapons. And I said, well, how was it? How did it go? And he said, it was awful. He said, I thought I had been given an absolutely impossible job. I would have to go out and sit in a tent in the desert and wait for him. And sometime he would gallop up on a camel and jump off with his robes flying. Sometimes he'd come in an armored car. Sometimes he'd come in by helicopter. And we'd sort of talk past each other for weeks. And then finally I began to see some logic to what he was trying to do, and he learned from me what was in it for him if he gave up his nuclear weapons. He was trying to get out from underneath the terrible stigma of the Pan Am sabotage and other things. So the Americans were brought in, and his nuclear weapons were given up, and he lived up to that agreement. And as I have said before, I think we are very fortunate that he did, because if he had not given up that program, I don't think that we would be in Libya at this point. So I am all for talking to these people. I wish Obama would start a dialogue with North Korea. They're not going to give up their nuclear weapons until we start talking to them, and the sooner we do it, the better. Now, having mentioned Gaddafi, I think I ought to raise one other issue, and that is, should we have gone into Libya? And I see your next month's speaker is going to give you the answers to all of this, that is, how to overthrow a dictator, and I would be very interested in what she has to say. Henry Kissinger and Jim Baker drew up a list of rules about what we should consider before making an intervention such as we have in Libya, and they're worth reciting to you if I can remember them. First of all, they said, we cannot be the world's policeman. We cannot be the world's policeman. There are too many places where it is tempting to get involved, but here are some things to think about before we do it. One, think about the circumstances in that country and how that relates to our military situation. Second, have a plan. Don't start something until you really know how you're going to end it. Third, know who you're supporting. Don't just go in and support any ragtag group that waves a flag and said, we need your help. Fourth, get some support from the American people through Congress. Fifth, try to anticipate the unintended consequences of what you create when you go into a country such as Libya. And in this case, it is the fact that the North Koreans and the Iranians will probably hold on to their nuclear weapons harder because they both are saying, look what happens when a country doesn't have nuclear weapons. And sixth and finally and most important, see how an intervention relates directly to our national interest. So there's some interesting thoughts from some very wise men. And I hope that this brief discussion of four very difficult characters may have awakened some questions in your minds. And thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Sky sends his regrets. He had to go back to the academy and teach a class at 1:30. My name's John Gould from Colorado College, and I'll be handling the Q&A. If you could state your question clearly and keep it relatively short, I'll hopefully be able to repeat it for the recording that we're doing. And please go ahead. Good question. Question is, given the emphasis on what we've done wrong in the past, could you explain some things that we are presently doing correctly?
Well, I think we're doing most things right today, just as we usually do. We are still a country deeply admired around the world. We give aid and assistance to many. We give counsel to many. We educate millions of people in our country who want to learn how we got to where we are. So I think it's very dangerous. I think your question is an interesting one. Because I'm talking about some things where events have not worked out as we thought they should, but that should not in any way call into question what we are and what we stand for as a country. I think there is a tendency to do that, particularly with 24-hour talking heads on the media. And so because so-and-so is wrong in such and such a place, he's wrong on everything. That's not the case. It's never been the case. And we are where we are because we've done far more things right than we have done wrong. This is going way back in the past, but my wife in New York saw last night a magnificent program on the aid we gave to the Soviet Union under Herbert Hoover's incidents. We saved millions of people from starving at the time of a terrible famine in the Soviet Union. I mean, we have the Marshall Plan is another thing. And so, you know, we must not get down on ourselves just because a few very difficult things take place and because we've made a few misjudgments. And it was very interesting. I was listening to Lee Kuan Yew, a man I admire very much from Singapore, and he was asked, well, how would you rate yourself? Why do people keep coming for you, to you? And he said, well, I am very much aware of mortality. I think of how I've affected people who had to take orders from me. I think about my family. And he said, I would say I've learned some things, and I haven't forgotten my mistakes. And he said, I'd give myself about a B+. I think most people would give him an A+, but that's the way he handled your question. Thank you.
I'll try to repeat that. The president came into office espousing a robust dialogue with everybody, regardless of ideological or other backgrounds. He seems to have backed off from that. Should he move more closely in that direction in the next few years?
I think he made a very idealistic statement when he was a candidate, and he made a couple of, I thought, very good speeches in Cairo where he talked about the need for better communications. And in that part of the world, he's very highly regarded for having made that kind of thing. He's not talking to the North Koreans, and I think he's making a mistake. He's not talking to Ahmadinejad. I'm not sure he's making a mistake there. I think that Ahmadinejad would use that in a way that would strengthen his position within Iran. He is very unpopular in Iran, and I think we are probably correct to do everything we can to strengthen those who oppose Ahmadinejad rather than just talking to him. I think a lot of things get said in political campaigns that once you've sat in the White House for a few weeks, you realize it's a hell of a lot harder to put them into effect than you thought it was when you first said them.
The question relates to the principle, know who you're supporting, one of the last 6 principles we discussed. What are the chances that we don't or miscalculate on this question and we don't know who we're supporting, and what do we do when they actually do come in power and do not share our interests or values?
That's a terrific question. When I started in CIA in 1951, the Dulles brothers were riding high. John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State, and Alan Welch Dulles was Director of CIA. And they had a list of 8 countries around the world where we didn't like the governments in power, and we were going to overthrow them one by one. And I've forgotten what all 8 were. I wish I could remember, but I remember the first 3. Number 1 was Iran. And Mossadegh was overthrown, the Shah returned. That was regarded as a great success. I would suggest that our problems in Iran today have many of their roots in that which took place in 1953. Number 2 was Guatemala, where we overthrew a leftist-leaning president and put in a bloody-minded militarist, leading to 2 very bloody decades in Guatemala. That did not work out. Number 3 was Cuba, and the Bay of Pigs got JFK off to a terrible start and paved the way for the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was, I think, the most dangerous moment in modern world history. Compare that with Nixon's opening to China. He reached out to Mao at a time when his hands were dripping with blood from the 19 to 20 million people who had been deliberately killed in the Great Cultural Revolution. But look what has happened to China since then. So my point is that you don't know what you're going to get when you support somebody on his own terms who's trying to change things in his country. But I think there's a greater chance of success than when a foreign country intrudes and bloodily overthrows a government and puts someone else in power for their national interest, not for the national interest of the people concerned. So it's risky either way, but I think history is in favor of people who come to change because they realize it's in their own interest to change. Now, people ask me, why in the world do you have a good thing to say about North Korea? And I'm saying I don't have a good thing to say about North Korea. They do terrible things to their people. How do you get them to stop? I think the easiest way to get them to stop is to draw them out of their isolation, answer some of their legitimate concerns, and that is the quickest way to get them to recognize that it is in their own interest to change. That's a great question, and that's about the best I can do in responding. Thank you.
Ambassador Gregg mentioned that we should not and cannot serve as the world's police force, and if we can't, then to whom should we transfer this responsibility? A group of nations, the United Nations, who is capable, aside from the United States, to lead?
Another really good question. There's a book out recently called American Caesars, which is written by a Brit, ranking the last 12 American presidents, starting with FDR and ending with George W. Bush. And he is very high on Truman, because Truman, FDR is number one in his book, but Truman rates very high because Truman saw, at the time he took over from Roosevelt, that the Brits, who had been the world's policemen, essentially, were no longer able to do that. Winston Churchill had been voted out of office. They were swamped with costs from World War II, and he saw the chance for America quite naturally to step forward to a position of world dominance. Usually, when that happens, a war accompanies it. But in this case, it did not, because the Brits knew they could no longer exercise that role, and they welcomed the United States as a close friend and a close ally. Now, there is nobody around at this point who can replace us. Nobody comes close. So there's not going to be the handing of this mantle to anybody. A lot of people, I think, are overly alarmist about China. Let's have this dialogue in 25 years and see how it plays out. You mentioned the UN. I'm glad you did. I'm glad to see Ban Ki-moon, a man I know quite well, becoming a bit more muscular in talking about things in the Ivory Coast, for example, where he has got the UN involved, saying that what this president, I don't even know how to pronounce his name, it's what he just cannot continue. And that's good. NATO is also trying to do its thing in Libya, and Sarkozy has a sense of France playing a role larger than itself. And those things can and should be supported. I think, like it or not, we are going to remain the world's only superpower for the foreseeable future, and the problem for us is how do we play that hand of cards as we become less and less dominant in the world.
Question is, at what point does one give up on talking and realize that one's actions are, I missed the last word, but I guess futile or not working, ineffective?
Well, I think Obama gave up on talking in Libya, and I agree with him. I think, in a way, I used to teach at Georgetown, and I used to say we're all haunted by the question of historical analogy, and we get seduced by it. I don't know how many times we've said this is just like Munich, so we've got to react as we did after, because no reaction was taken at Munich. But I think each situation is very different, and each has to be judged on its own merits. And it's a difficult choice, but I think that Libya was one thing. I was going to say the situation in Afghanistan with President Karzai reminds me hauntingly of our situation in Vietnam with President Diem. He would not do what we wanted to do. He cracked down on the Buddhists when we urged him not to. Karzai is corrupt. He will not rein in corruption. And so in Vietnam, we stopped talking and overthrew him. And I was at a meeting before that happened, and some of the war hawks who wanted to overthrow him called the American ambassador, whose name's Fritz Nolting, back to Washington. This is a guy named Roger Hilsman, who'd been with OSS in Burma. And he said, well, Fritz, you were sent out there to deal with No and Diem. What do you have to say about them? And Nolting said, I have one thing to say. He said, there's nobody with the guts and sang-froid of those two brothers in Vietnam, and if we overthrow them, we're going to be saddled with a descending spiral of mediocre generals. And so we overthrew him, they were killed, and that's exactly what we dealt with.
So the question was, recently Joseph Nye gave a talk at Colorado College and discussed the new era in U.S. foreign policy issued in by Obama through his, with his discussions with the UN and the Arab League and so on, his multilateral efforts to get support for our efforts in Libya, and that this was something of a new departure in recent U.S. foreign policy. And so I guess if you could comment on that.
Joe Nye is a terrific guy, and I think he's basically right. I think that Obama was very wise to get support as much as he did, but I don't think that's always going to be possible. I think we have very difficult choices lying ahead of us. Because in some instances, nobody's going to step up to the plate. Bill Clinton is haunted by the fact that we sat still and did nothing in Rwanda. He also had to be pushed by Dick Holbrooke before he became involved in the Balkans. And so that's why being president is such a difficult job, because you need to weigh all the factors. And I'm rather surprised in thinking over this list of lessons that Kissinger and Baker listed that they don't list the thing you mentioned, and that is how much support from other organizations can we have before going in. I think that would be a seventh rule that I would like to add. So Joe Nye was right, and thank you for following up on it.
Okay, difficult question to summarize quickly, but Whitney's focusing in on the individuals themselves, their beliefs, their ideologies, their standard operating procedures as the possible threat themselves rather than the capabilities they have. And so what do we do when the actual individual leaders themselves are the threat? How do we move on from that?
That's a very tough question, and I would say Iran and Syria are, I think the Syrians are cracking down in a way very reminiscent of the father who brutally killed thousands of people 20 or so years ago. I think it would be a mistake for us to get involved in the Syrian mess. Iran is an extremely difficult question. I think it is central to our foreign policy, and I don't have any shortcut answers. I hope that CIA is doing a good job in giving us a clear appraisal of the strength of the opposition, who is in it, how solid are the Iranian armed forces. But that, I think, is probably number one on the difficult and dangerous foreign policy issues that Obama is wrestling with today. Should we talk? With whom? About what? And at what point do we consider other methods, and what's our game plan there? So I have, you're right in spotting it, and I wish I had a clear-cut answer, but I don't.
Great. We have time for one more question. Who would like to? Okay. Why don't we actually take both questions together, and then we'll allow Ambassador Gregg to finish up. So we'll start off with a question over here. The first question is, what are the chances that General Petraeus will get us out of Afghanistan? And the second question is, does the ambassador have any insight into the CIA, U.S. government's proactive current efforts in Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt?
Let me answer the second one first. We've got people on the ground in Libya. I think that is one thing that the agency does extremely well. It started doing it well in Vietnam. It has done it in Afghanistan, and it's now doing it in Libya. And as I speak on college campuses, I am asked by a number of young men, how about joining CIA? And my answer to them is, join the Marines for 3 or 4 years, and if you like that, then apply to the agency. In terms of will Petraeus get us out of Afghanistan? If we fail, we will have failed for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons. And we have something to leave behind, which is very controversial, and that's the whole question of our drones and their pinpoint attacks on individual targets. It's very effective. It's very off-putting in a way, but it leaves you with a very powerful weapon with a very small footprint. And we may be reduced to that in Afghanistan. Thank you very much for all your questions.